The life of a man ended not with a bang nor a whispered prayer, but with the rhythmic flick of a feline tongue lapping at a mysterious, smoky liquid. In the winter of 1820, a prosperous farmer named John Bell lay in a deep, unnatural coma, while his family watched in silent horror as a drop of medicine from an unknown vial killed a house cat in mere seconds. A voice from the shadows, a voice that did not belong to any living soul in that room, cackled with a chilling triumph, claiming to have personally brewed the poison that would finally silence the man it had tormented for years. This was the first and only time in the history of the United States that a spirit would be officially credited with the assassination of a human being. Before we descend further into the darkness of the Red River Valley, make sure to subscribe to Sleep History Stories and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a chapter of our deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past. The year was 1817, and the landscape of Adams, Tennessee, was a tapestry of survival and prosperity, woven into the rugged frontier of a young nation. John Bell was a man of high standing, a pillar of the community who had carved a thriving estate out of the wild timberlands and the rich soil of the Red River. To the outside observer, his life was a testament to the American dream, with a devoted wife, a growing family, and barns overflowing with the harvest of his labor. But beneath the surface of this idyllic peace, a slow rot was beginning to take hold, a subtle shifting of the air that signaled the arrival of something ancient and malevolent. The first sign was the silence. It started as an absence of the usual nocturnal symphony of the Tennessee woods, a night when the crickets stopped their chirping and the owls refused to hoot. John Bell was walking through his cornfield under the pale light of a waning moon when he encountered a creature that defied the laws of nature. It had the body of a large dog, but the head of a rabbit, its eyes glowing with a dull, feverish light as it sat perfectly still amidst the stalks of corn. When Bell raised his gun, the creature did not run. It simply vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a coldness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. In the days that followed, the silence of the farm was replaced by a series of rhythmic disturbances that began at the edges of the property and slowly moved inward like a predator circling its prey. It started with the sound of phantom birds pecking at the window panes and the scratching of invisible claws against the exterior logs of the cabin. The family tried to dismiss it as the wind or the movement of wild animals, but the sounds were too deliberate, too intelligent to be a product of the natural world. Each night, the scratching grew louder, moving from the walls to the floorboards, and eventually under the beds of the children. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, began to notice the shifts first. She described a sensation of being watched by eyes that had no face, a presence that lingered in the corners of her room, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. Her father, ever the pragmatist, told her it was merely the imagination of a young girl living in a lonely part of the country. But even he could not ignore the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the household. The air in the Bell home began to feel thick, like the atmosphere before a violent storm, and a strange metallic scent would occasionally waft through the halls, for which there was no logical source. the local community in Adams knew the Bells as a God-fearing family people of integrity who did not indulge in ghost stories or superstitions. But as the winter of 1817 approached, the disturbances could no longer be contained within the walls of the farm. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights dancing over the Red River and heard the sounds of phantom wagons rolling down empty roads in the middle of the night. It was as if the very ground of the Bell estate had become a thin spot in the fabric of reality, allowing something from the other side to reach through. John Bell found himself walking the perimeter of his land more frequently, clutching a lantern against the encroaching dark. He began to see shadows that moved independently of the trees, shadows that seemed to possess a weight and a will of their own. One evening, while checking on his livestock, he found his cattle standing in a perfect circle, all facing inward toward an empty patch of grass, their eyes wide with a primal terror. There was no sound, no movement, yet the animals refused to break their formation until the sun rose the following morning. The psychological toll on the family was immediate and profound. They stopped speaking of the occurrences to outsiders, fearing the stigma of madness or the judgment of the church. Within the cabin, the family huddled together by the fireplace, the once warm and inviting space now feeling like a fortress under siege. The scratching had evolved into the sound of heavy chains being dragged across the porch and the muffled voices of what sounded like people whispering just outside the door in a language that no one could understand. This was the beginning of the end of the Bell family as they knew it. The prosperous farm was no longer a place of refuge, but a laboratory for a force that sought to dismantle their sanity piece by piece. The entity, which would soon be known as the Bell Witch, was not yet a voice, but it was already a presence, a weight on their chests that made it hard to breathe in the deep quiet of the Tennessee night. As we close this first chapter, the silence has been broken, and the entity has crossed the threshold. The question is no longer if they are being haunted, but why this family, and what does this force truly want? Fear is a slow poison. It does not always arrive with a scream or a sudden blow. Often, it begins as a subtle disturbance in the natural order of things, a sound that is slightly out of place, a shadow that lingers a second too long. For the Bell family, the autumn of 1817 was the season when the silence of the frontier began to unravel. It was the time when the scratching began, not on the edges of the property, but within the very heart of their sanctuary, within the walls of the cabin itself. If you find peace in the mysteries of the past, please consider subscribing to Sleep History Stories. Your support allows us to keep these forgotten legends alive for your nights of rest. The Bell cabin was a fortress of heavy oak and cedar logs. It was built to withstand the harshest Tennessee winters and to keep out the wolves that still roamed the dark valleys of Adams. But a fortress is only as strong as the peace within it. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the orange glow of the hearth fire began to fade into embers, a new and unsettling sound took hold. It started in the corners of the ceiling, a sound like a giant rat gnawing at the wood. John Bell would take his candle and climb to the loft, searching for a nest or a stray animal. But he found nothing. The wood was cold and solid. Yet, the moment he stepped back down the ladder, the gnawing would begin again, louder and more rhythmic than before. It was a sound of immense patience, a sound that suggested something was trying to find a way in, or perhaps something was trying to find a way out of the very structure of the house. The children would lie in their beds with their blankets pulled tight to their chins, listening to the invisible claws moving behind the headboards. It was not a random sound. It followed them. When Betsy moved her bed to the other side of the room, the scratching followed her within an hour. It was as if the entity was tethered to her presence, using the timber of the house as a medium to communicate its growing strength. By the second week of October, the scratching had evolved into something more physical. The family began to hear the sound of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor in the rooms above them when they knew the rooms were empty. They would rush up the stairs only to find every chair and every table exactly where it had been left. The air in those rooms was always 5 degrees colder than the rest of the house, a heavy, stagnant cold that felt like stepping into a tomb. John Bell began to lose sleep. He spent his nights sitting in the main hall with a shotgun across his knees, watching the shadows dance in the candlelight. He was a man who believed in things he could touch and see. But how do you fight a sound? How do you protect your family from a noise that seems to possess an intelligence? One night, the disturbances took a darker turn. The youngest son, Richard, woke up screaming that someone was pulling his hair. When his mother, Lucy, rushed into the room, she found the boy huddled in the corner of his bed. His hair was matted and knotted in a way that seemed impossible for a human hand to achieve in such a short time. The knots were tight and intricate, like the work of a weaver. As Lucy tried to untangle them, she felt a sharp, cold breeze pass through the room, though all the windows were shut and bolted. The scratching in the walls stopped instantly and was replaced by a low, muffled sound that resembled a person choking or gasping for air just behind the wood panels. The psychological weight of these nights began to show on the faces of the Bell family. Their eyes grew sunken, and their voices became hushed. The farm, which was once a place of laughter and industry, had become a house of whispers. They began to wonder if they had brought something back from the fields, or if the land itself held a memory that was now waking up. Neighbors who passed by the property noticed that the Bell dogs would no longer bark at strangers. Instead, they would cower near the porch, their tails tucked, and their eyes fixed on the empty windows of the upper floor. Even the animals knew that the hierarchy of the house had changed. The scratching was no longer just a noise. It was a countdown. It was a language without words. John Bell attempted to rationalize it as the settling of the logs or the expansion of the wood in the cold night air, but the patterns were too complex. The sounds would sometimes mimic the rhythm of a person walking. Thump, 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 slowly moving from one end of the hallway to the other. Sometimes it sounded like a heavy chain being dropped onto the floorboards, followed by a long, slow slide. The family began to realize that whatever was in their house was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a force that was learning. It was observing their reactions, feeding on their fear, and preparing for the moment it would finally find its voice. Imagine the absolute darkness of a frontier night. There are no streetlights, no distant hum of machinery. There is only the wind in the trees and the heavy silence of the valley. In that silence, even the smallest sound is magnified. Now imagine lying in that darkness and hearing a rhythmic scraping just inches from your ear. A scraping that sounds like bone on wood. You reach out your hand to touch the wall, and you can feel the vibration of the claws. You can feel the heat of something moving on the other side of the timber. But when you strike a match, there is nothing there. Only the solid, unyielding oak and the long, distorted shadows of your own fear. This was the reality for the Bells for weeks on end. They were trapped in a loop of anticipation, waiting for the sun to rise so they could escape the house, and waiting for the sun to set with a dread that paralyzed their hearts. The entity was no longer content with being heard. It wanted to be felt. It wanted to cross the boundary between the walls and the inhabitants. And as we move into the next chapter of this chronicle, the scratching will stop and the first physical contact will begin. The shadows are no longer just watching, they are reaching out. The boundary between the seen and the unseen is often a thin veil of silence. For the Bell family, that veil did not tear all at once. It frayed slowly, thread by thread. The scratching that had plagued their nights for weeks began to soften, melting into a series of guttural whispers and low, wet, gurgling sounds that seemed to emanate from the very air they breathed. It was as if the entity was a child, learning to use lungs it did not possess, struggling to shape the heavy atmosphere into the sharp edges of human speech. One evening, as the family sat in the dim light of the hearth, a voice finally broke through a voice that was at once multiple people and no one at all. It was a sound that began as a low hiss and ended as a clear command. If this journey into the shadows of Tennessee is helping you find a moment of calm in a busy world, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and leave a comment below about which part of the Bell Witch legend fascinates you the most. The first intelligible words were not a scream or a threat. They were a recitation of the Lord's Prayer. It began as a faint murmur in the corner of the room, a rhythmic cadence that matched the breathing of the family. John Bell held his breath, leaning closer to the wall, hoping to find a rational explanation. But the voice grew louder, moving from the corners to the center of the table. It was a high, thin voice like a woman's, but with an underlying rasp that felt like dry leaves skipping across stone. When the prayer ended, the voice began to laugh, a melodic but hollow sound that echoed in the chimney. The family realized with a cold certainty that they were no longer dealing with a haunting of shadows, but a haunting of intelligence. This entity was not a mindless spirit. It possessed a memory that was terrifying in its precision. Within days of its first words, the voice began to mimic the family members. It would call out to Lucy in the exact tone of her husband, and it would whisper to the children using the comforting voice of their mother. The confusion it created was a psychological weapon. John would rush to the kitchen thinking Lucy had called for him, only to find her working silently in the garden. The children would stop their play, convinced their father was speaking to them from the loft, only to see him walking the fields in the distance. The house was becoming a labyrinth of echoes where the truth was impossible to find. It was during this period that the entity was given the name that would endure for centuries. When asked who it was, the voice replied in a mocking tone that it was the spirit of a woman named Kate. To the local community of Adams, this name carried a specific weight. Many whispered that it was Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John Bell had a long and bitter dispute over land and money. Kate Batts was a woman of fierce independence and a sharp tongue, often accused of practicing the dark arts by those who feared her. The entity seemed to delight in this association, adopting the name with a sense of theatrical malice. From that moment on, the force that occupied the Bell farm had a face and a name. But Kate was far more than a simple, vengeful neighbor. Her knowledge exceeded the boundaries of the Red River Valley. She began to demonstrate a terrifying ability to be in multiple places at once. During social gatherings at the farm, neighbors would test the spirit, asking her to report on what was happening at their own homes, miles away. Kate would answer instantly, describing in vivid detail the clothes people were wearing, the conversations they were having, and even the contents of the meals they were cooking. One famous account describes Kate reciting the sermons given by two different ministers at two different churches simultaneously, even though the churches were 20 miles apart. She repeated every word, every gesture, and every prayer with absolute accuracy. The intelligence of the voice was as sharp as a razor. Kate would engage the family in long theological debates, quoting from the Bible and the works of classical poets with a fluency that John Bell could not match. She would point out the hypocrisies of the local church leaders and reveal the hidden sins of the men who came to the farm to investigate her. She knew who had stolen a neighbor's sheep 10 years prior, and she knew which of the pious deacons was hiding a gambling debt. She was an omnipresent judge, a force that stripped away the veneer of frontier respectability to reveal the raw and often ugly truth beneath. As the voice grew stronger, the atmosphere of the cabin changed. It no longer felt like a home, but like a stage where a malevolent play was being performed every night. The air was constantly vibrating with the sound of Kate's chatter. She sang hymns, she cursed, she told bawdy jokes, and she whispered prophecies that made the skin crawl. The once private lives of the Bells were now being narrated by an invisible spectator who never slept. The lack of privacy was a special kind of torture. There was no corner of the estate where her voice could not reach, and no thought that she seemed unable to perceive. In the deep quiet of the late-night hours, when the fire had burned down to a low red glow, Kate's voice would change. It would lose its mocking edge and become something more ancient and elemental. She would speak of the stars and the long history of the land before the settlers arrived. She would talk about the rivers of gold that flowed beneath the mountains and the spirits that guarded the ancient burial mounds. In these moments, the family felt a strange, almost hypnotic calm. The voice was no longer a threat, but a storyteller, weaving a tapestry of a world they could barely imagine. But the calm was always short-lived. Kate was a creature of chaos, and her moods shifted like the wind over the Tennessee hills. One night, after a long period of silence, the voice spoke directly to John Bell in a whisper that was as cold as ice. She told him that she would never leave until he was in his grave, and that she would follow his bloodline until the debt was paid in full. When Bell asked what debt he owed, the voice only laughed and began to sing a lullaby that Lucy had once sung to her children. The psychological siege was reaching its peak. The scratching was gone, replaced by something much worse. A voice that knew their names, a voice that knew their secrets, and a voice that was beginning to dictate the terms of their existence. As we conclude this chapter, the identity of the Bell Witch has been established, but her true nature remains a mystery. She is a linguist, a theologian, a gossip, and a judge. She's moved into the very center of the family's life, and she is preparing to strike. In the chapters to come, we will see how this voice turned into a physical force and how it sought to destroy the person John Bell loved most in the world. The silence of the Red River has been replaced by a chorus of the damned, and the nightmare is only just beginning. Imagine a hand striking a face in the dead of night. Not the hand of a frustrated parent or a schoolyard bully, but a hand that has no weight, no warmth, and no visible form. The sound of the slap echoes through the small wooden cabin, a sharp crack that cuts through the silence like a whip. In the flickering candlelight of the Bell home, the family watched in a state of paralyzed grief as red welts appeared on the cheeks of young Betsy Bell. There was no attacker to wrestle to the ground, no monster to drive away with a lantern. There was only the air itself turning into a weapon. Before we delve into the heart of this tragedy, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our community of night travelers as we explore the mysteries that linger in the shadows of time. Betsy Bell was the heart of the household. In the year 1818, she was a girl of 12 or 13, described by those who knew her as a vision of innocence with golden hair and a spirit that brought light to the often somber frontier life. She was her father's pride and joy, a child who seemed destined for a life of quiet prosperity and perhaps a happy marriage to one of the local suitors. But to the entity known as Kate Betsy was not a treasure to be protected. She was a target, the spirit that showed a strange, almost reverent respect for the mother. Lucy Bell harbored a deep and inexplicable hatred for the daughter. The torment did not begin with violence. It began with the hair. Every morning, Betsy would wake with her long tresses tangled in ways that defied explanation. These were not the simple knots of a restless sleeper. They were intricate braids and tight, painful whirls that seemed to be tied with a professional precision. When her mother tried to comb them out, Betsy would cry out in pain, as if the hair was being pulled from the roots by invisible fingers. The family watched as these knots appeared in real time, while Betsy sat by the fire. Her hair would suddenly lift into the air, as if caught in a localized wind, and begin to twist and coil around itself, forming a bird's nest of tangles that required hours of gentle labor to undo. Then came the physical assaults. It started with small pinches and pokes that left tiny bruises on her arms and neck. But as Kate's voice grew stronger, so did her physical reach. During family meals, Betsy would suddenly be jerked backward from the table, her chair skidding across the floor as if pulled by a powerful rope. She would scream as her face was slapped by unseen palms, leaving the distinct imprint of fingers on her skin. The attacks were relentless and unpredictable. Betsy could be walking to the well, or sitting in the parlor when she would be thrown to the floor, or dragged across the room by her hair. The psychological toll was devastating. Betsy became a prisoner in her own skin. She suffered from frequent fainting spells, falling into deep, death, like trances that lasted for hours. In these states, her breathing would become so shallow that her brothers often feared she had passed away. When she awoke, she would speak of being in a dark place where a cold hand was clamped over her mouth, preventing her from screaming for help. The medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to explain these episodes. The local doctors spoke of hysteria or nerves, but the physical evidence was undeniable. No nervous condition could cause a chair to fly across a room or a girl to be lifted 2 feet off the bed by an invisible force. One of the most chilling aspects of this period was the entity's possessiveness. As Betsy grew into a young woman, she began to attract the attention of a local school teacher named Joshua Gardner. Joshua was a man of good character, and his intentions were honorable. The two fell in love, and their courtship was the talk of Adams. But Kate was a jealous guardian. Every time Joshua came to visit, the disturbances would escalate into a frenzy of violence. The spirit would scream insults at the young man, calling him a fool, and threatening his life if he did not leave Betsy alone. During their walks along the Red River, the young couple would be pelted with stones that fell from a clear sky. Joshua would feel an invisible hand pushing him toward the edge of the water or pulling at his coat. Inside the house, the spirit would blow out the candles the moment they sat down together and whisper obscenities in Betsy's ear that only she could hear. It became clear that the Bell Witch intended to destroy any chance of happiness for the girl. The entity's voice would cackle in the darkness, declaring that Betsy would never marry anyone as long as John Bell was alive. There is a theory among some modern researchers that the haunting was a manifestation of Betsy's own repressed trauma, or perhaps a sophisticated form of ventriloquism. They point to the fact that the voices and the violence were most intense when she was present. They suggest that the pressure of being the perfect frontier daughter in a strictly religious household caused a fracture in her psyche. But this theory fails to account for the hundreds of witnesses who saw these events occur while Betsy was across the room or even in a different building. It does not explain how a young girl could possess the strength to move heavy oak furniture or the knowledge to speak in 4 different voices simultaneously. The reality was much simpler and much more terrifying. Betsy was the medium through which the entity fed. Her energy, her fear, and her youth were the fuel that allowed Kate to manifest in the physical world. The Bell cabin had become a cage where a predator toyed with its prey. Every night was a battle for survival. Every morning was a reprieve that only brought the dread of the coming sunset. The family prayed, the community fasted, and the local ministers shouted their gospels into the rafters, but Kate only laughed. She told them that their God had no power here, and that she was the only law in the valley of the Red River. As we end this chapter, the physical and mental state of Betsy Bell has reached a breaking point. She is a shadow of her former self. Her golden hair matted her skin pale, and her eyes filled with a constant flickering terror. The entity has successfully isolated her, and the stage is set for the final confrontation. But the spirit is not finished with the men of the house. While Betsy is the victim of her malice, her father, John Bell, is the target of her ultimate plan. The scratching has stopped, the voice has spoken, and the blows have been felt. Now, the poison is being prepared. There's a specific kind of horror in watching a strong man break. John Bell was the iron of the Red River Valley, a man whose word was law, and whose physical strength had carved a kingdom out of the Tennessee wilderness. But even iron can be corroded by a persistent acid. By the winter of 1818, the patriarch of the Bell family was no longer the commander of his estate. He was a man haunted by a sensation that defied medical science. He described it as a feeling of stiff wooden sticks being forced into his mouth and jammed against his jaw whenever he tried to speak or eat. It was as if an invisible hand was trying to pry his dignity from his body, leaving him stuttering and breathless in the face of his own family. Before we witness the tragic descent of the man who built this legacy, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join us as we uncover the dark truths of the past. Your presence helps us keep these stories alive in the quiet of the night. The entity known as Kate did not just attack John Bell. She mocked him. Every time John felt the stiffness take hold of his face, a high, thin cackle would erupt from the shadows of the room. The witch would laugh until she sounded breathless, delighting in the sight of the proud farmer clawing at his own throat. She called him Old Jack and told him that his tongue was becoming too heavy for his lies. When John tried to pray, the laughter would turn into a mocking imitation of his own voice, twisting the holy words into obscenities. The pillar of the community was being turned into a caricature of himself, and the psychological weight of this humiliation was more painful than any physical blow. John's physical deterioration was visible to everyone in Adams. His face, which had once been full of life and authority, began to sag on one side. His tongue would swell until it filled his mouth, making it impossible for him to swallow even a drop of water. He spent his days sitting by the window, staring out at the land he had worked so hard to tame. But the land no longer belonged to him. The entity had claimed the house, the fields, and the very air he breathed. Kate would often whisper to him in the dead of night, telling him that she was the one who truly owned the Red River, and that he was merely a guest who had overstayed his welcome. The family watched in helpless grief as their father shriveled before their eyes. Lucy Bell would sit by his side for hours, rubbing his cold hands and trying to coax him to eat a little broth. But every time the spoon touched his lips, the entity would strike it away, or the sticks would return, forcing his jaw shut with a bone-cracking force. Kate would sing a mocking lullaby during these moments, a distorted version of a song about a man who lost everything to the wind. The cruelty of the spirit was surgical. She knew exactly which nerves to trigger to cause the most agony, and she knew exactly which memories to evoke to cause the most shame. John Bell began to avoid the public. He no longer attended church or oversaw the business of the farm. He became a prisoner in the master bedroom, listening to the voice of Kate as she narrated his decline to the rest of the house. She would tell the children that their father was a hollow shell, and that his strength had been a lie. She would recount stories from his past in North Carolina, stories of debts and disputes that John had hoped were buried forever. The entity was not just killing his body, she was assassinating his character, stripping away the layers of respectability he had built over a lifetime. One evening the house was unusually quiet. The fire had burned low, and the shadows were long and heavy. John Bell managed to find his voice for a brief moment, and he called his sons to his bedside. He tried to tell them where the deeds to the land were kept and how to protect their mother after he was gone. But before he could finish, the laughter returned. It started as a low gurgle in the corner of the ceiling and grew into a deafening roar that shook the logs of the cabin. Kate screamed that he had no right to give away what was already hers. She claimed that the Bell bloodline was hers to toy with, and that his death would only be the beginning of her reign. The sensory experience of John Bell's haunting was unique. Unlike Betsy, who suffered from outward violence, John suffered from an inward constriction. He felt as though he were being buried alive within his own skin. The air around him always felt thin and cold, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by an invisible vacuum. He would often reach out into the empty air, grasping for something to hold on to, only to feel the cold, slippery sensation of a hand that wasn't there. Kate would whisper that she was the only one who would stay with him until the end, and that his family would soon forget the man he used to be. The tragedy of the man with the sticks is the tragedy of a man who outlived his own power. In the harsh world of the Tennessee frontier, a man was defined by his ability to provide and protect. When Kate took those things away, she left John Bell with nothing but his fear. The farm continued to run under the management of his sons, but the spirit of the place had vanished. The laughter of the witch became the new rhythm of the household, a constant reminder that the patriarch had been dethroned. As the year 1819 drew to a close, the once vibrant John Bell was a ghost, haunting his own home, waiting for the final blow that would release him from the sticks in his mouth. In the chapters to come, we will see how the world outside the Red River Valley began to react to the horror of the Bell Farm. The legends reached the ears of those in high places, and the arrival of a future president would bring a new level of scrutiny to the haunting. But for John Bell, the arrival of generals and neighbors meant nothing. He was locked in a private war with an entity that had already won. The poison was not yet in the vial, but the shadow of it was already falling across the threshold of his room. The man with the sticks was fading, and the witch of the Red River was just getting started. In the early 19th century, few names commanded as much respect or struck as much fear as Andrew Jackson. He was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, a man of iron will, and a future president of the United States. He was a soldier who had faced the might of the British Empire and the ferocity of frontier warfare without flinching. But in 1819, even this man of steel found himself humbled by a force that did not bleed and did not retreat. It was a clear afternoon when Jackson and his entourage of soldiers and horses approached the boundaries of the Bell Farm, and the world, as they knew it, simply stopped moving. If you are finding rest in these echoes of history, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleep History Stories. Your support helps us continue our journey into the quiet mysteries of the past. Leave a comment about what you think the general truly saw that night. The journey from Nashville was supposed to be a simple expedition of curiosity. Jackson had heard the whispers of the Tennessee witch, and like many men of logic, he suspected a clever hoax or a local superstition. He brought with him a wagon, a team of horses and several of his most trusted men, intent on exposing the fraud and restoring peace to the Red River Valley. As they reached a flat stretch of road near the Bell Estate, the heavy wagon suddenly creaked to a halt. The drivers lashed the horses, and the animals strained until their muscles bulged, and the harness leather groaned, but the wheels did not turn an inch. There was no mud. There were no rocks wedged in the spokes. The ground was dry, and the road was clear. It was as if the earth itself had reached up and seized the axles in a grip of iron. Jackson stepped down from his horse, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He ordered his men to put their shoulders to the wheels and heave with all their might, but the wagon remained anchored to the spot as if it were a part of the bedrock of Tennessee. In that moment of strained breathing and confused silence, a high metallic voice rang out from the surrounding woods. The voice told the general that they could proceed now and that she would see them again at the house that evening. As soon as the words faded, the horses leaped forward with such ease that the men fell into the dust. The invisible weight had vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Jackson, ever the pragmatist, tried to laugh it off, but his eyes remained fixed on the long shadows of the oak trees. He realized then that he was no longer the commander of this territory. He was an uninvited guest in a realm governed by laws he did not understand. When the party finally reached the Bell cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with an unnatural stillness. John Bell greeted them with the hollow eyes of a man who had already given up, and for the first time in his life, Andrew Jackson felt a cold draft of doubt. That night, the soldiers decided to camp near the house while the general stayed within the cabin. One of the men, a boisterous soldier who claimed to be a professional witch hunter, brandished a silver bullet and a heavy pistol. He boasted that no spirit could withstand his aim and that he would end the haunting before the sun rose. As he spoke, the air in the room seemed to thicken and grow cold. Without warning, the soldier began to scream and thrash about the floor, his body contorting as if he were being beaten by a dozen invisible clubs. He was dragged through the door and across the porch by his heels, his cries echoing into the dark woods until he was finally released and fled into the night without his boots or his pride. Inside the cabin, Jackson watched in grim silence. He sat by the fireplace, his sword across his knees, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. He heard the scratching in the walls and the heavy thuds of invisible footsteps on the roof. He heard the voice of Kate as she sang a distorted version of a war song, her voice shifting from a child's giggle to the rasp of an old woman. She called out to Jackson by name, mocking his military victories and telling him secrets about his own past that he had never shared with a living soul. She spoke of his political rivals and his personal losses, her words cutting through his defenses like a saber. The general did not sleep that night. He spent the hours in a battle of wills with an entity that delighted in his presence. Kate did not physically attack Jackson as she had the others, but she made it clear that his status as a national hero meant nothing to her. She blew out his candles and whispered in his ear, in the total darkness, telling him that the Red River would outlast his republic, and that his fame was merely a flicker of light in a deep forest. Jackson, who had faced cannons and bayonets, found himself shivering in the gloom of a simple farmhouse. By the first light of dawn, the man who would be president had seen enough. He did not wait for breakfast, and he did not attempt to investigate further. He ordered his men to ready the horses and the wagon, and they departed the Bell Farm with a haste that bordered on a retreat. Legend says that as they reached the crest of the hill, Jackson turned to his companions and declared that he would rather face the entire British army than face the Bell Witch again. It was a rare admission of defeat from a man who prided himself on victory. He had looked into the abyss of the unknown, and the abyss had laughed back. Curiously, when one looks into the meticulously kept journals and official records of Andrew Jackson's life, there is no mention of this encounter. There are no letters to his wife describing the wagon stopping, and no reports to his colleagues about the haunting. This silence is perhaps the most telling detail of all. For a man of Jackson's ego to experience such a total loss of control was a humiliation that could not be recorded. It was a memory he chose to bury in the red clay of Tennessee. The general had retreated, but the spirit of the Red River remained, her laughter echoing in his ears for years to come. This encounter served to cement the legend of the Bell Witch in the American consciousness. If a man like Andrew Jackson could be driven away, what hope was there for a simple farming family? The haunting was no longer a local dispute or a family tragedy. It was a phenomenon that had challenged the highest authority in the land. As the wagon wheels rolled back toward Nashville, the silence returned to the Bell estate. But it was a heavy, expectant silence. Kate had shown her power to the world, and now she was ready to return her full attention to the man who remained in her grasp. The assassination was drawing closer, and the shadows were growing long. What is more terrifying than a monster that can break your bones? It is a monster that can read your soul. By the middle of 1819, the entity known as Kate had achieved a level of intellectual dominance that paralyzed the community of atoms. She was no longer just a voice, she was a chorus. Witnesses began to report that the spirit could speak in 4 distinct and identifiable voices, often at the very same time. They were known by the names she gave them: mathematics, typography, black dog, and Jerusalem. Each voice possessed its own personality, its own cadence, and its own specific area of expertise. It was a psychological, shattered mirror, reflecting the darkest corners of the human experience. If these whispers from the past are helping you find a moment of stillness, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our circle of listeners. Your presence is the light that keeps these shadows at bay. The voice called mathematics was cold and precise. It spoke with a mechanical rhythm, devoid of any human emotion, as if it were reciting the laws of the universe. It would spend hours calculating the crops of the neighbors, or predicting the exact number of leaves on a specific oak tree with a terrifying accuracy. Then there was Jerusalem, a voice that sounded like a feverish preacher shouting of fire and brimstone, quoting obscure passages of scripture that even the most learned theologians in Tennessee had never heard. Between these extremes lay the black dog, a low guttural snarl that spoke only in threats, and typography, which whispered in riddles and codes that seemed to hint at a world beyond human understanding. But the true power of these voices lay in their ability to strip away the masks of the living. The Bell Farm became a place of public judgment where neighbors would gather not just to witness the supernatural, but to test their own courage. Kate took a special delight in unearthing the sins that men thought they had buried in the red clay of their past. One evening, a man named John, a respected member of the local parish, stood in the parlor and challenged the spirit to prove its power. The room went deathly silent as the voice of Kate shifted into a low, accusatory hiss. She began to recount an event from 10 years prior in a different county. She spoke of a rainy night and a stolen sheepskin. She described the exact barn where the theft took place, the color of the horse the man was riding, and the shame he felt as he hid the evidence under his floorboards. The man, John, turned a ghostly shade of white, his hands trembling, as he realized that this invisible entity had seen him in his most private moment of weakness. There was no defense against a witness who did not need eyes to see. The crowd watched in a mixture of horror and fascination as their own secrets began to feel heavy in their pockets. Kate was a voyeur of the soul, and no one was safe from her gaze. The gossip of the witch was not limited to petty crimes. She knew who was unfaithful. She knew who had cheated their brothers out of an inheritance, and she knew who among the pious leaders of the church was secretly struggling with a bottle of whiskey in the dark. She would call these people out by name during prayer meetings, her voice echoing from the rafters of the cabin with a mocking laugh. "You speak of heaven," she would scream at a deacon, "while your heart is full of the dirt of the earth." The social fabric of Adams began to fray. People stopped visiting the Bells, not because they feared the spirit, but because they feared what the spirit would say about them in front of their neighbors. It was during this time that Kate's Thauthi or clairvoyance reached its peak. She would narrate the events of the town as they were happening in real time. She would tell the Bell family that a traveler was currently crossing the river 5 miles away, describing the color of his hat and the limp in his horse's gait. 20 minutes later, the traveler would arrive at the door exactly as she had described. She was an omnipresent observer, a living network of information that made the walls of every house in the valley seem as transparent as glass. This was a new kind of haunting. It was a haunting of information, where the weapon was not a slap or a scratch, but the truth itself. The intelligence of the 4 voices suggested a being that existed outside of linear time. Mathematics would speak of stars that would not be discovered for centuries, and Jerusalem would prophesy the coming of wars that would tear the young nation apart. They spoke with the authority of entities that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations long before the first settler set foot in Tennessee. In the quiet hours of the morning, when the neighbors had gone home and the Bell family was left alone, the voices would merge into a single, low hum, a sound that resembled 1,000 people whispering at once. It was a sound that made the brain ache, a vibration that seemed to pull at the very stitches of reality. Lucy Bell, the mother, remained the only one who received any kindness from this chaotic chorus. While the voices would scream at John and mock Betsy, they would often sing softly to Lucy when she was weary. They would tell her where to find misplaced items, or warn her of a coming storm so she could bring in the laundry. This selective respect was perhaps the most confusing part of the haunting. It showed that the entity possessed a moral compass, however warped it might be. Kate chose to be a protector for one and a destroyer for the others. She was playing a game of emotional chess, moving the members of the family against each other with a master's touch. As the sun sets on this chapter of the Bell legacy, the four voices have become the new masters of the Red River. The house is no longer a home. It is a court of law, where the judge is invisible and a jury is made of shadows. The secrets of the valley have been laid bare, and the pride of John Bell has been crushed under the weight of his own history. But the voices are not content with just speaking the truth. They are preparing to reveal the oldest secret of all, a secret that dates back to the dark woods of North Carolina, a secret that involves blood and a debt that can only be paid in the currency of a human life. In the next part of our journey, we will leave the Bell Farm and travel back in time to the origins of John Bell's past. We will look into the shadows of North Carolina to find the man who died and the ghost that refused to stay buried. The voices have hinted at the answer, and now it is time for us to listen. The silence is returning, but it is the silence of a grave being dug. A man's past is a shadow that grows longer and darker as his life reaches its sunset. For years, John Bell had cultivated the image of a righteous pioneer, a man who had left the rolling hills of North Carolina to build a new destiny in the fertile soil of Tennessee. But the red clay of the Red River Valley was not deep enough to bury what he had left behind. In the winter of 1819, as the entity known as Kate began to peel back the layers of his sanity, the truth finally clawed its way to the surface. It was a story of a rainy afternoon, a heated argument, and a single shot that echoed through a forest hundreds of miles away. John Bell was not just a victim of a haunting. He was a man running from a ghost he had created with his own hands. If these deep dives into the darker side of history are helping you unwind, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our community of night travelers. Your support is the heartbeat of this channel, and we are honored to have you with us in the shadows. Before the Bell family arrived in Tennessee, they were residents of Halifax County, North Carolina. John was already a man of means, a slave owner, and a landowner with a reputation for being a stern and unyielding master. He employed an overseer, a man whose job was to ensure the productivity of the farm through whatever means necessary. History has blurred the name of this man, but the memory of his death remained crystal clear in the mind of John Bell. On a day when the air was thick with the scent of wet pine and damp earth, a dispute erupted between the master and his servant. Some say it was over money, others say it was over a matter of pride. But as the sun began to set behind the North Carolina pines, a confrontation turned into a tragedy. John Bell, reaching for his authority, or perhaps his fear, fired a weapon. The overseer fell into the mud, his life spilling out into the cold rain. In that moment, the quiet woods of Halifax County became a crime scene, and John Bell became a killer. Though he was a man of status and influence, he could not escape the law. He was brought to trial facing the judgment of his peers in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and desperate secrets. The trial was a spectacle. John Bell used his wealth and his connections to navigate the treacherous waters of the legal system. He argued self-defense, claiming the overseer had threatened his life. In the end, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty. John Bell walked out of that courtroom, a free man in the eyes of the state, but he was a condemned man in the eyes of his community. The whispers began in the taverns and the churches. People looked at his hands and saw a stain that no amount of prayer could wash away. It was this social exile, this heavy atmosphere of judgment, that finally drove him to pack his wagons and move his family west toward the frontier of Tennessee. He thought he was escaping. He thought that by crossing the mountains and changing his surroundings, he could shed his old skin like a snake. For a decade, it seemed he had succeeded. The Bells became the elite of Adams, and the story of the overseer became a distant murmur, lost in the noise of building a new empire. But Kate, the entity that knew every secret of the soul, would not allow him to forget. She began to reenact the murder within the walls of the Tennessee cabin. She would create the sound of a phantom gunshot that made the windows rattle, and she would whisper the name of the dead man in John Bell's ear while he tried to sleep. Kate's mockery took on a new and specific cruelty. She would describe the feeling of the bullet entering the flesh and the coldness of the mud as the life faded away. She told John that the overseer had been waiting for him in the darkness of the Red River, and that she was merely the messenger of his revenge. This was the debt of blood that the spirit had hinted at. The haunting was not a random occurrence. It was a cosmic rebalancing. The ghost of North Carolina had found its voice in the form of the Bell Witch, and it would not be silenced until the scales were even. Imagine the psychological torture of living with a crime that the world has forgotten, but a spirit remembers every detail of. John Bell began to see the face of the dead man in the swirling smoke of the fireplace. He would hear the sound of wet boots walking across his porch in the middle of the night. Boots that left no prints, but carried the weight of a heavy conscience. Kate would laugh, telling him that he could run to the ends of the earth, but he would always be the man in the rain with a smoking gun in his hand. His authority as a father and a leader was crumbling under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The entity began to use this secret to alienate John from his family. She would whisper to Lucy and the children, asking them if they truly knew the man they shared a roof with. She would hint at the violence that lay beneath his pious exterior, suggesting that the same hand that stroked their hair had once taken a life. The trust within the household was evaporating. Every time John tried to defend himself, Kate would simply recite the testimony from the trial, mocking his lawyers and the foolishness of the jury. She was a prosecutor from the beyond, and her evidence was undeniable. As we conclude this exploration into the shadows of North Carolina, the true nature of the Bell Witch haunting becomes even more complex. Is Kate a separate entity, or is she the personification of John Bell's buried guilt? Is she a demon from the pit or the restless spirit of an overseer seeking the justice he was denied in life? Whatever the truth, John Bell was now a man trapped between two worlds. He was being hunted by the past and tormented by the present. The Red River was no longer a place of refuge. it was a trap. In the chapters to come, we will see how this revelation of the past affected the community's perception of the haunting. The battle between John Bell and the witch was reaching a fever pitch, and the entity was preparing for its final act of destruction. The poison was being brewed not just in a vial, but in the long memory of a man who thought he had escaped. The silence of the woods is returning, but now it is filled with the sound of a clock ticking toward a final judgment. To be hunted by a spirit is a terror of the mind, but to be hunted by your own neighbors is a terror of the soul. In the year 1818, while the physical body of John Bell was being dismantled by the invisible hands of Kate, his reputation was being put on trial in the world of the living. For a man of the 19th century frontier, his standing in the church was his only shield against the darkness of the wilderness. But that shield was about to be shattered. The Red River Baptist Church, a modest wooden building that had once been a place of refuge for John, became the stage for his ultimate humiliation. He was no longer the benefactor or the leader. He was the accused. He was the outcast. If you are finding a moment of quiet reflection in these stories of Old Tennessee, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our community. Your support is the light that helps us navigate these dark corridors of time. The conflict began with a whisper of greed. Jeremiah Batts, a relative of the woman whose name the witch had stolen, brought a formal complaint against John Bell. The charge was usury, the practice of lending money at interest rates that were considered predatory and unchristian. In a society that lived and died by the word of the Bible, usury was not just a legal dispute, it was a mortal sin. The community that had once looked up to John now looked at him with a cold, calculated suspicion. They saw his fine house and his large harvests, and they began to wonder if his prosperity was built on the suffering of his brothers. The day of the church trial was gray and oppressive. The congregation gathered in a silence so thick it felt like wool. John Bell entered the building, leaning heavily on a cane, his face twisted by the invisible sticks that Kate had forced into his jaw. He sat on a hard wooden bench, feeling the eyes of every man and woman in the room, burning into his back. The air smelled of wood smoke and old Bibles, but to John, it smelled like a trap. He tried to stand and defend himself to explain the complexities of the business deal, but his tongue felt like lead. The words would not come. Then, from the rafters above the pulpit, a familiar voice broke the silence. It was the high, mocking cackle of Kate. She did not hide in the shadows of the farm. That day she followed him into the house of God. The congregation gasped as the Spirit began to narrate the trial, her voice echoing off the walls with a terrifying clarity. She whispered the exact amounts of money John had charged and the names of the families he had pressured for payment. She revealed the secrets of his ledger books, mocking his attempts to appear pious, while his heart was focused on the collection of coin. The witch was acting as the star witness for the prosecution, and there was no way to cross-examine a ghost. The ministers looked up in horror, searching the empty air for the source of the voice. They prayed for the spirit to depart, but Kate only laughed louder. She told them that their prayers were hollow, and that John Bell belonged to her. She recounted the argument over the land with Kate Batts, and how John had used his influence to bend the law in his favor. The dignity of the church meeting was gone, replaced by a spectacle of supernatural judgment. John Bell sat in his pew, his head bowed, unable to meet the gaze of his neighbors. He realized then that he was being stripped of everything: his land, his money, and now his place in the kingdom of heaven. The verdict was inevitable. The church leaders declared that John Bell was to be excommunicated. He was cast out of the fellowship, his name struck from the rolls of the faithful. In the eyes of the community, he was now a dead man, walking a sinner who had been abandoned by God and marked by the devil. As the congregation filed out of the building, no one stopped to offer him a hand or a word of comfort. They walked past him as if he were a shadow, a ghost that had not yet realized it was dead. John was left alone in the empty church with only the voice of Kate for company. She whispered in his ear, telling him that he was finally where he belonged. She said that the living were finished with him, and that the dead were just beginning their work. The isolation was absolute. At home, the spirit continued to tear at his body, and in the town, his name was a curse. He began to spend his days in the deep woods near the Red River, away from the judging eyes of men. But even there, the trees seemed to whisper his sins, and the wind carried the sound of the congregation's silence. He was a man without a country, a man without a church, and a man without a future. This was the true strategy of the haunting. Kate did not just want to kill John Bell. She wanted to erase him. She wanted to remove every pillar of support until he had nothing left to hold on to. The psychological warfare had been successful. The patriarch had been dethroned, the father had been discredited, and the Christian had been exiled. The community of Adams had collectively turned its back on the Bell farm, leaving the family to fight a war they could not possibly win. The silence of the neighbors was more painful than the screams of the witch. As the shadows grow longer over the Red River, we see a man who has reached the end of his path. John Bell is now a prisoner in his own mind, trapped between the memory of his crimes and the reality of his punishment. The spirit has isolated her prey, and the final act is prepared. The poison is no longer a metaphor. It is a physical reality waiting in the dark corner of a medicine cabinet. The church doors have closed, and the grave is waiting to open. In the next chapter, we will return to the cabin for the final confrontation. The battle between the flesh and the spirit is reaching its climax, and the air is thick with the scent of a smoky liquid. The spiritual warfare is over, and the physical assassination is about to begin. The Red River is rising, and it is carrying the Bell family toward a destination from which there is no return. Faith is often described as a shield, but for the men gathered in the Bell cabin during the winter of 1819, that shield felt as thin as parchment. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows of the Tennessee woods began to stretch toward the porch, a group of the most devout ministers in the Red River Valley prepared for a night of spiritual combat. They brought with them their oldest Bibles, their most fervent prayers, and a certainty that the name of God would be enough to silence the entity known as Kate. But the cabin did not smell of incense or holiness. It smelled of ozone and stagnant air. The men of the cloth did not realize they were not entering a sanctuary. They were entering a trap where their own scriptures would be turned into weapons against them. If this immersive journey into the dark corners of American history is helping you find a moment of stillness, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories. Join our community of night travelers as we seek the truth buried beneath the layers of time and legend. The air in the room was so cold that the breath of the ministers hung in the air like ghostly veils. Sug Fort and James Blair, two pillars of the Baptist and Methodist faith, sat across from John Bell, who was now little more than a trembling shadow of a man. They began the vigil with a low, rhythmic chanting of the Psalms, their voices steady and rhythmic, intended to anchor the room in the divine. For the first hour, the house was unnaturally still. The scratching in the walls had stopped, and even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. But this was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of an audience, waiting for a performance to begin. Without warning, a heavy Bible resting on the center table was slapped shut by an invisible hand. The sound was as loud as a gunshot, echoing through the small room and snuffing out 3 of the 4 candles. From the darkness near the ceiling, the voice of Kate emerged, not as a scream, but as a soft, scholarly whisper. She began to recite the very verses the ministers had just finished, but she did so with a fluency and a rhythmic beauty that made their own efforts sound clumsy and dull. She did not stumble over a single syllable, and she infused the words with a subtle mockery that made the holy text feel like a dark incantation. One of the ministers stood and commanded the spirit to depart in the name of the Father. Kate responded by laughing a sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room at once. She asked him which father he was referring to, and then began to recount a secret moment of doubt he had experienced while traveling alone through the mountains. She quoted the private thoughts he had never shared with his congregation, thoughts of a world without a God, and the fear of a silent heaven. The man sank back onto his bench, his face pale as he realized that his own mind was no longer a private sanctuary. Kate was not just a spirit. She was a mirror reflecting the cracks in their own faith. The night wore on into the early hours of the morning, a time when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb. The ministers attempted to conduct a formal exorcism, calling upon every heavenly power they could name. Kate countered every prayer with a perfect theological rebuttal. When they spoke of mercy, she spoke of the slaughter of the innocents in the Old Testament. When they spoke of light, she spoke of the outer darkness where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth. She demonstrated a knowledge of Hebrew and Greek that left the educated men speechless. She was a scholar of the abyss, using their own armor to find the gaps in their souls. By 3 a.m, the candles had burned down to mere stubs, and the fire in the hearth was a pile of gray ash. The physical exhaustion began to set in. The ministers found their voices growing hoarse, their tongues heavy, and their thoughts scattered. Kate intensified her assault, moving from theological debate to physical manifestation. She pulled the rugs from beneath their feet and blew a cold, putrid air into their faces that smelled of the grave. She whispered in their ears, telling them that their prayers were hitting the ceiling and falling back to the floor like dead birds. She told them that the Red River was her kingdom and that the God they served had no jurisdiction in the valley of the shadows. One of the younger men in the group attempted to shout a final, desperate plea for deliverance. Kate responded by seizing his throat and forcing him to his knees. His eyes rolled back in his head as he struggled to breathe, and the entity began to sing a high, clear hymn that sounded like the voice of 1,000 angels. But the words were wrong. The hymn spoke of a world where the dark had won and the stars had gone cold. The contrast between the heavenly melody and the hellish message was a psychological blow that finally broke the will of the group. They realized that they were not fighting a simple ghost, but an ancient intelligence that delighted in the dismantling of human hope. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window shutters, the ministers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. They did not speak to John Bell, and they did not look each other in the eye. They had come to save a family, but they had only succeeded in losing a part of themselves. Kate's voice followed them to the porch, mocking their retreat and telling them to come back when they had found a faith that wasn't built on sand. The spiritual warfare had ended in a total rout. The House of the Bells was no longer a place of prayer. It was a territory occupied by a power that had proven itself superior to the church. This night marked the final collapse of any organized resistance against the entity. If the holy men of the valley could not drive her away, what hope was there for a broken farmer and his tormented daughter? The community of Adams began to accept a terrifying reality. The Bell Witch was not an intruder. She was the master of the estate. John Bell sat in the ruins of his parlor, listening to the silence of the retreating ministers. He knew now that no heaven was coming to save him. The entity had isolated him from his neighbors, his church, and his God. The stage was finally clear for the final act of the tragedy. As we end this chapter, the air in the Bell cabin remains heavy and cold. The Bibles are closed, the prayers have ceased, and the shadows are waiting. The spirit has won the war for the soul, and now she is turning her attention to the body. The smoke of the candles is faded, but a new scent is beginning to fill the room. A scent of iron and ash. The liquid in the vial is being prepared, and the long night of John Bell is reaching its darkest hour. In the next chapter, we will witness the event that would change American folklore forever. The winter of 1820 has arrived, and with it, the final breath of the man who built the farm. The assassination is no longer a threat. It is a promise. The Red River is waiting for its sacrifice. Time did not flow in the Bell cabin on the morning of December 20th, 1820. It thickened and stalled like blood in a cold vein. The world outside was a brittle landscape of frost and iron-gray skies, but inside the air was charged with a heavy, suffocating stillness. John Bell lay in his bed, his chest barely moving, his face a mask of gray stone. The sticks that had tormented his jaw for years were no longer a sensation. They were a permanent paralysis. He was drifting in the twilight between a life of labor and a death of mystery, and his family stood around him like statues carved from grief. In that moment of absolute silence, a single object on the medicine shelf caught the flickering light of a dying candle, a small glass vial filled with a smoky liquid that seemed to swirl with a life of its own. Before we witness the final breath of the man who dared to defy the darkness, please take a moment to subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our circle of night travelers. Your support is the light that keeps these chronicles alive in the deep quiet of the evening. The discovery of the vial sent a jolt of terror through the room. It was not a bottle that any doctor had prescribed, and it was not a remedy that Lucy Bell had ever seen. John Bell Jr. reached for the glass, his fingers trembling as he felt the unnatural coldness of the surface. He uncorked the bottle, and a scent wafted out that defied description. It was the smell of ancient dust of burnt copper and of something sweet and rotting all at once. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with a low hum, as if the liquid was singing a song of departure. The family looked from the vial to the unconscious patriarch, realizing that the poison was not just a substance, it was a sentence. To test the nature of this mysterious gift, they called for the family cat, a creature that had long avoided the sick room. They placed a single drop of the smoky liquid on the animal's tongue. For a heartbeat, the world remained silent. Then time shattered. The cat began to contort its body, twisting in ways that were physically impossible, its eyes turning a vivid, unnatural blue before rolling back into its head. It did not cry out. It simply vibrated with a violent energy until its heart stopped with a dull thud. The animal was dead in less than 10 seconds, its fur standing on end as if it had been struck by lightning. The family backed away from the bed, the realization hitting them like a physical blow. The medicine that John had taken the night before was not a cure. It was an assassination. As the realization settled into their bones, the voice of Kate erupted from the shadows behind the bed curtains. It was not the mocking giggle of a girl or the rasp of a scholar. It was a roar of absolute triumph. I fixed his medicine last night. She screamed, her voice shaking the logs of the cabin. I gave him a big dose, and it fixed him. She began to laugh, a sound that was so loud and so full of malice that the children covered their ears and fell to their knees. She sang a song of victory, claiming her prize and mocking the dead cat as a mere herald of what was to come. The witch had moved beyond the realm of haunting. She had become a killer, and she wanted every soul in the Red River Valley to know it. John Bell died shortly after the sun began to climb over the frozen hills. His final breath was a long, rattling sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his secrets and all his sins out into the morning air. The man who had survived the frontiers of North Carolina and the wars of the wilderness had been laid low by a drop of smoke in a glass. As his eyes glazed over, the room became suddenly warm. The putrid scent of the liquid vanished, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and the faint sound of a woman humming a lullaby. It was as if the entity was satisfied, having finally extinguished the spark that had occupied her attention for so long. The aftermath was a scene of clinical and legal confusion. The local authorities were called, and the vial was examined, but the science of 1820 was a blunt instrument. They found traces of what they suspected was arsenic, but the origin of the bottle remained a void. How could a physical poison be placed in a locked cabinet by an invisible hand? The official record of the county was forced to grapple with a reality that defied the law. In a document that remains a curiosity of American jurisprudence, the death of John Bell was attributed to the influence of a spirit. It was the only time in the history of the nation that a ghost was named as the primary suspect in a murder. For the family, the death was a double tragedy. They had lost their father, but they had also lost their sense of safety in the world of the living. The farm was no longer a legacy. It was a monument to their failure to protect the man they loved. Lucy Bell sat by the body, her face a mask of calm that hid a shattered heart. She did not cry. She simply stared at the empty medicine shelf, her mind replaying the moment the smoky liquid was discovered. She realized that the witch had not just taken her husband's life, she had taken the meaning of his struggle. He was no longer John Bell, the prosperous farmer. He was John Bell, the victim of the Red River. The community of Adams reacted with a mixture of horror and a dark kind of relief. The spectacle was over, but the price had been paid in blood. People spoke in hushed tones about the assassination, wondering if the witch would now move on to a new target, or if the death of the patriarch would satisfy her hunger. The funeral was prepared not with the usual rites of a pioneer leader, but with the fearful haste of people trying to bury a curse. They wanted John Bell in the ground before the moon rose again, fearing that even in death, the spirit would not let him rest. As we conclude this chapter, the cabin is a place of shadows and mourning. The man with the sticks is gone, but the laughter of Kate remains etched into the wood of the walls. The Red River continues to flow indifferent to the tragedy on its banks. The assassination was a moment of absolute darkness, a point where the supernatural crossed over and left a permanent scar on the history of a young nation. The poison has done its work, and the vial is empty, but the story is far from over. A grave is being dug in the frozen earth, and a new chorus of the damned is preparing to sing. In the next part of our journey, we will witness the funeral of John Bell, an event where the spirit did not remain silent. We will see the final mockery at the graveside and the chilling song that echoed through the trees as the first shovel of dirt was thrown. The king is dead, but the witch is still on her throne. The earth of Tennessee in winter is a cold and unforgiving host. On the day of John Bell's funeral, the sky was the color of a bruised lung, and a biting wind whipped through the leafless branches of the oaks along the Red River. A long procession of wagons and mourners moved slowly toward the small family cemetery on the knoll behind the house. They walked in a silence that was heavy with a collective dread. These people were not just burying a neighbor. They were burying a man whose life had been extinguished by a force they could not see and could not understand. As the first shovelful of frozen dirt hit the wooden lid of the coffin, a sound rose from the woods that made the horses scream and the men reach for their knives. It was not a cry of mourning. It was a song. If you are seeking peace in the quiet echoes of the past, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories. Your support is the light that keeps these chronicles alive in the deep quiet of the evening. The service was led by Reverend James Blair, a man who had seen the horrors of the Bell cabin firsthand. He stood at the edge of the open grave, his Bible clutched in his trembling hands, trying to offer words of comfort to a family that had forgotten the meaning of the word. He spoke of the resurrection and the life to come, his voice cracking under the strain of the freezing air. But as he began the final prayer, the atmosphere around the grave shifted. The temperature dropped so sharply that the mourners could see their breath freezing into a thick fog. Then, from the very center of the hollow grave, the voice of Kate emerged. She began to sing a high, clear, and terrifyingly beautiful melody. It was a popular song of the time, a rowdy tune about the joys of a successful harvest and a life well lived. But coming from the depths of the earth where the dead man lay, the words sounded like a profanation. Kate's voice grew louder and louder, drowning out the reverend's prayer, until he was forced to stop speaking altogether. She mocked the ceremony with every note her laughter woven into the lyrics like a jagged thread. She sang of the old man in the box and how his medicine had finally worked, telling the crowd that she would stay to watch the worms do their work. The reaction of the townspeople was one of pure animal terror. Men who had fought in the wars of the frontier backed away from the grave, their faces pale and their eyes wide. Women huddled together, hiding their faces in their shawls to muffle the sound of the witches singing. It was as if the ground itself was celebrating the assassination of John Bell. The dignity of the funeral was stripped away, leaving only a raw and ugly spectacle of supernatural malice. The spirit did not want a quiet burial. She wanted a triumph. She wanted every soul in Adams to know that even in the grave, John Bell was not beyond her reach. Betsy Bell stood as still as a statue, her eyes fixed on the dirt being thrown into the hole. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply watched as her father was covered by the cold red clay. The song of the witch seemed to be directed at her, a constant reminder of the jealous guardian that now stood between her and the world. Kate's voice whispered in the wind, telling the girl that the debt was only half paid and that the bloodline of the Bells was still her playground. The funeral was not an ending. It was a transition. The target had shifted, and the spirit was already looking toward her next act of destruction. As the last of the dirt was smoothed over the grave, the singing abruptly stopped. The wind died down, and the sudden silence was more deafening than the music had been. The mourners fled the cemetery as if they were being chased, leaving the Bell family alone with their grief and their ghost. They walked back to the cabin in a daze, the sound of the victory song still echoing in their ears. The Red River Valley felt different now. The air was thinner, the shadows were deeper, and the sense of isolation was absolute. The patriarch was gone, but the power that had killed him was more present than ever. That evening, the family sat in the kitchen, the hearth fire offering little warmth. The chair where John Bell used to sit was empty, but the atmosphere of the room was still heavy with his presence and the spirit's mocking commentary. Kate began to recount the funeral to the empty room, laughing at the reverend's stuttering and the fear in the neighbor's eyes. She spoke of the coffin as a fine new suit for old Jack, and wondered aloud how long it would take for his memory to fade into the dust. The cruelty was relentless, a constant grinding of the family's spirit that left them too exhausted to even weep. The victory song at the grave was a turning point for the legend. It was the moment the Bell Witch moved from a family haunting to a regional nightmare. It proved that the spirit was not bound by the walls of the house, and that the sanctity of the grave offered no protection. The story of the singing at the funeral spread through the state of Tennessee, and beyond reaching the ears of skeptics and believers alike. It was a detail that added a layer of grotesque theatricality to the tragedy. The witch did not just kill, she performed. She was a storyteller who insisted on having the last word, and that word was a song of ice and ash. As we end this chapter, the grave of John Bell remains a lonely spot on a frozen hill. The grass has not yet begun to grow, and the headstone is a cold slab of silence. But for those who live in the valley, the song is never truly gone. They hear it in the rustle of the dry leaves and the creak of the river ice in the dead of winter. The assassination was complete and the funeral was over, but the spirit of Kate was just beginning her long game. The Red River is a cold witness to the death of a man and the birth of a haunting that would never truly sleep. In the next part of our journey, we will look toward the year 1828. 7 years have passed since the death of John Bell, and the spirit has made a promise to return. We will see how the family tried to rebuild their lives, and the moment the shadows began to move, once again. The silence is only a pause in the music, and the song of the witch is waiting for its next verse. 7 years is a lifetime in the memory of a frontier family. From 1821 to 1828, the Bell farm experienced a peace that was so profound it felt unnatural. The scratching had stopped, the voices had faded, and the shadows seemed to have returned to their proper places. John Bell Jr. had taken his father's place as the head of the household, and Betsy had attempted to find a quiet path through the wreckage of her youth. But those who lived along the Red River knew that this was not a departure. It was a ceasefire. The entity known as Kate had promised to return, and as the winter of 1828 approached, the air in the cabin began to turn cold with the weight of a coming storm. The silence was about to be broken by a voice that spoke not of the past, but of a future that no human mind could yet conceive. If you are finding a moment of clarity in these stories of the strange and the forgotten, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join us as we watch the threads of time unravel. Your presence is the anchor that keeps us grounded in the turning tides of history. The return of the spirit was signaled by a low vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth beneath the cabin floor. John Bell Jr. was sitting alone by the fire one evening when the logs suddenly flared with a brilliant violet light. He did not feel fear. He felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the darkness of the corner. Then the voice returned. It was clearer than it had ever been refined by the years of silence into a tone of absolute authority. Kate did not ask about the farm or mock the memory of his father. Instead, she began to speak to him as if he were a student and she was a teacher of the end of the world. She began to describe a great and terrible conflict that would wash over the land like a tide of blood. She spoke of a time when the states of the young republic would turn against each other, brother against brother, and father against son. She described giant iron birds that would sail through the clouds and iron horses that would gallop across the plains on paths of fire and smoke. To a man living in the 1820s, these descriptions were like a fever dream. Kate spoke of the end of the institution of slavery, claiming that the very ground that John Bell Sr. had worked would one day be watered by the tears of a broken nation. She was narrating the American Civil War, decades before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. The prophecies grew even more surreal as the night wore on. Kate spoke of a time when men would carry small glass boxes in their pockets, boxes that held the voices and faces of people from across the oceans. She described a world where the night was chased away by a captured lightning that lived in glass bulbs, and where carriages moved without horses, guided by an invisible explosion within their metal hearts. John Bell Jr. listened in a trance, his mind struggling to translate the spirit's words into images he could understand. She was showing him the 20th century, the age of information and the era of machines. Her voice filled with a cold, detached amusement at the frantic pace of human progress. This was a different kind of haunting. Kate was no longer interested in the petty grievances of a Tennessee farm. She was demonstrating her position as a witness to the entire span of human existence. She told John that the lives of men were like the patterns of frost on a window pane, beautiful for a moment, but destined to vanish with the rising sun. She claimed to have seen the rise of the pharaohs and the fall of the Caesars, and she promised that she would be there to watch the final flickers of humanity as the earth returned to the ice. The House of the Bells was no longer just a site of a murder. It was a window into the abyss of time. The psychological impact of these revelations on John Bell Jr. was transformative. He was no longer the simple farmer his father had been. He became a man burdened by a knowledge that isolated him from the rest of the world. How could he speak to his neighbors about the price of corn when he had been told of a world that would be destroyed by a sun captured in a metal shell? Kate stayed for 3 weeks, her voice a constant presence in his ear, guiding him through the labyrinth of the future. Then, as quickly as she had arrived, she announced that her work in the house was finished. She told him that she would see his descendants in 107 years, and that the name of the Bell Witch would endure as long as men feared the dark. The final departure of the spirit in 1828 was accompanied by a sound like 1,000 birds taking flight from the chimney. The air in the cabin became suddenly light, and the oppressive weight that had defined the Bell estate for a decade was gone. But the family did not celebrate. They were left with the echoes of the prophecies and the chilling realization that they were merely characters in a story that was much larger than themselves. Betsy Bell eventually moved away, seeking a life where the name of Kate was not whispered in the wind, but the shadows followed her even into old age. The 1828 return solidified the intellectual stature of the Bell Witch. She was not a common ghost or a simple demon. She was an entity that possessed a grasp of history and technology that defied every law of the physical world. Her predictions, which were recorded by John Bell Jr. in his notes, became a source of fascination for generations of researchers. Many of the events she described came to pass with a terrifying precision, lending a layer of prophetic dread to the already dark legend. The witch had moved from being a local killer to a global mystery, a figure that stood at the intersection of folklore and the unknown. As we end this chapter, the Bell farm has finally become quiet. The wagons have moved on, the children have grown, and the cabin has begun to succumb to the slow decay of time. The Red River still flows through the valley, a silent ribbon of water that remembers the voices of the night. The prophecies are locked away in a drawer, but the memory of them lingers like the scent of ozone after a storm. The entity has retreated into the silence, but the countdown has begun. The 107-year promise is a clock ticking in the dark of the Tennessee woods. In the next part of our journey, we will leave the 19th century behind and explore the modern echoes of the haunting. We will look into the Bell Witch Cave, the place where the spirit is said to have retreated, and we will examine the reports of those who have dared to enter its depths in the 20th and 21st centuries. The legend is not a relic of the past. It is a living presence that continues to challenge the boundaries of science and belief. The silence of the cave is waiting, and the next chapter is about to begin. The transition from the open air of a Tennessee meadow to the mouth of the Bell Witch Cave is not just a change in geography. It is a descent into a different state of being. As you step away from the sunlight and into the limestone shadows, the sounds of the modern world, the distant hum of cars and the rustle of the wind fade into a heavy, absolute silence. The air becomes thick with the scent of wet stone and ancient earth, and the temperature drops so sharply it feels like a physical hand pressing against your chest. This is the place where the entity known as Kate claimed she would retreat after her work at the Bell Cabin was finished. It is a labyrinth of cold stone and black water that has become a permanent monument to the haunting. And for those who dare to enter the darkness, the history of 1820 is no longer a story. It is a living presence. If these modern encounters with the unknown are keeping you company, in the quiet hours, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and join our community of night travelers. Your support allows us to keep these investigations into the shadows alive for generations to come. The Bell Witch Cave sits on a bluff overlooking the Red River, a jagged opening in the earth that seems to breathe with a rhythm of its own. Geologists speak of limestone erosion and underground springs, but for the people of Adams, the cave is a gateway. Legend says that one of the Bell sons discovered a human jawbone. In the depths of these tunnels, a relic of an ancient burial that many believe sparked the original haunting. Today, visitors report that the cave does not welcome outsiders. Professional photographers have walked into the darkness with fully charged batteries, only to have their equipment die in a matter of seconds. Digital cameras often capture nothing but a dense black void, even with powerful flashbulbs, while others find their lenses covered in a fine red mist that has no logical source. In 2016, a paranormal researcher named Sarah entered the cave with a highly sensitive digital recorder, hoping to capture an electronic voice phenomenon. She spent an hour in the deepest chamber, the silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. When she returned to her hotel and played back the audio, she did not find a scream or a curse. Instead, she heard a soft, rhythmic humming, a lullaby that matched the descriptions given by Lucy Bell 2 centuries prior. As the humming faded, a single word was whispered directly into the microphone, a word that Sarah had never shared with anyone on the trip. It was the name of her grandmother, who had passed away years before. The entity was not just recording the present, it was accessing the memories of those who stood in its home. Other visitors speak of the sensation of being touched by fingers that are as cold as ice. A young man exploring the lower tunnels felt a sudden sharp tug on his hair, nearly pulling him off his feet. When he turned his flashlight toward the shadows, he saw nothing but the glistening walls of the cave. But when he emerged into the sunlight, his companions pointed out a series of red welts on his neck, the distinct imprint of a small hand. It was a physical echo of the torment Betsy Bell had suffered long ago. The cave is a place where time seems to fold in on itself, allowing the malice of the past to reach out and strike the inhabitants of the present. The technical malfunctions are perhaps the most consistent reports. Smartphones will suddenly display a date of 1817, and the GPS systems of cars parked near the bluff will spin wildly, as if they are searching for a satellite in a different dimension. Some believe that the limestone in the area acts as a massive battery storing the energy of the haunting and releasing it in bursts of electromagnetic interference. Others suggest that the entity simply delights in the dismantling of human technology, mocking our reliance on glass and silicon, just as she mocked the prayers of the 19th century ministers. To Kate, a digital recorder is no more a threat than a silver bullet. There is a specific chamber in the cave, known as the throne room, where the atmosphere is so oppressive that many people find it impossible to stay for more than a few minutes. They speak of a sudden, overwhelming sense of grief, a sadness so heavy it feels like drowning. They hear the sound of a woman weeping in the darkness, a sound that moves from the walls to the center of the room. When they try to offer words of comfort, the weeping turns into the familiar mocking laughter of the witch. It is a psychological trap designed to lure the curious into a state of vulnerability. The cave is not just a shelter. It is a predatory environment that feeds on the emotions of the living. The town of Adams continues to live in the shadow of this hole in the ground. The annual Bell Witch Festival and the guided tours of the cave have turned the tragedy into a local industry. But the locals know where to draw the line. They do not visit the bluff after sunset, and they do not speak the name of Kate in the presence of children. They have seen enough strange lights moving through the trees and heard enough unexplained voices on the wind to know that the promise of 1828 was not an empty one. The countdown to the return is a reality. They carry in their bones a silent clock that is ticking toward a date only the spirit knows. As we stand at the threshold of the modern era, the mystery of the Bell Witch remains as unyielding as the limestone of the cave. We have mapped the tunnels, we have analyzed the water, and we have recorded the shadows, but the heart of the haunting remains a void. It is a story that refuses to be categorized, a haunting that is both physical and psychological, historical and contemporary. The cave is a reminder that there are places on this earth where the rules of logic do not apply, where the past is never truly gone, and where the darkness has a voice. The Red River flows on, carrying the secrets of the bells toward the sea, but the cave keeps its own counsel. In the final chapter of our journey, we will pull back the veil and examine the theories that seek to explain the impossible. We will look at the science, the folklore, and the dark possibilities that remain after all other explanations have failed. We will reach the end of the 23,000 words, and we will leave you with a question that will haunt your own dreams. The silence of the cave is behind us, and the final judgment is ahead. The long night of the Bell Witch is reaching its conclusion, but the shadows are never truly still. Every story must eventually return to the silence from which it was born. The fire in the Bell cabin has long since turned to cold white ash, and the voices that once shook the rafters of the frontier home have faded into the rustle of the Tennessee wind. But as we stand at the final threshold of this 200-year mystery, we are left with more than just a legend of a haunting. We are left with a mirror. The story of the Bell Witch is not just a tale of ghosts and shadows. It is a record of the human struggle to explain the impossible. As the shadows of the Red River Valley lengthen across the landscape of our minds, we must finally confront the three pillars of thought that have attempted to hold the weight of this tragedy. We must decide for ourselves where the truth lies, or if the truth is something that was never meant to be found. If this long journey into the heart of American folklore has helped you find a moment of rest, please subscribe to Sleep History Stories and leave a final comment below. What is the one detail of this story that will stay with you when the lights go out? Your thoughts are the bridge between the past and the present. The first pillar is the shadow of human deception. For 2 centuries, skeptics have pointed toward the young girl at the center of the storm, Betsy Bell. They suggest that the entity was not a spirit from the abyss, but a sophisticated manifestation of a fractured psyche. In the rigid and often oppressive atmosphere of a 19th century religious household, a young girl's only power was her voice. They argue that Betsy, through a masterly command of ventriloquism and a desperate need for attention, created the character of Kate. They see the physical assaults as acts of self-harm and the flying furniture as clever tricks played on a family already paralyzed by superstition. In this version of the story, the Bell Witch was a cry for help, a rebellion against a father's control that grew so powerful it eventually took on a life of its own. But even this theory falters when we remember the hundreds of witnesses, the official legal records, and the knowledge that exceeded the reach of any frontier child. If it was a lie, it was a lie so perfect that it became indistinguishable from reality. The second pillar is the cold clinical light of science. Modern researchers look at the symptoms of John Bell, his paralyzed jaw, his swelling tongue, and his final coma, and they see the fingerprints of a physical killer. They speak of the high levels of arsenic and other toxins that were often found in the home remedies of the time. They suggest that the smoky liquid in the vial was not a supernatural poison, but a tragic mistake, or a deliberate act of murder by a person of flesh and bone. They point to the geological features of the Red River Valley, suggesting that pockets of natural gas or a specific alignment of limestone could have caused auditory illusions and shared hallucinations among the inhabitants of the farm. In this world, there are no witches, only chemistry and biology, and the tragedy of the Bells was a medical mystery that was mislabeled as a haunting. Yet science cannot explain the prophecies that came true a century later, or the wagon that refused to move under the command of a future president. The third pillar is the most unsettling of all, the belief that the entity known as Kate was an absolute reality, a force that exists outside the boundaries of human logic, a judge that arrived to collect a debt that was centuries old. To those who follow this path, the Bell Witch was a cosmic reminder that the world is not as solid as we believe it to be. She was an entity that demonstrated a command over time-space and the human soul, proving that our prayers and our laws are mere whispers in a vast and ancient darkness. In this version of the story, John Bell was not a victim of a daughter's trick or a chemist's potion. He was a man who was weighed in the balance and found wanting. The haunting was a ceremony of justice performed by a spirit that did not need a courtroom to deliver its verdict. As we lie in the quiet of the night, we realize that perhaps the answer does not belong to any single pillar. Perhaps the Bell Witch is all of these things at once. She is the trauma of a family, the poison in the glass, and the shadow in the woods. She is a reminder that history is not a straight line of progress, but a circular dance of secrets and revelations. The farm is gone. The cabin has rotted into the earth, and the descendants of the Bells have scattered to the four corners of the world. But the Red River still flows. It carries the memory of the scratching in the walls and the victory song at the grave. It carries the silence of the ministers and the retreat of the general. The true legacy of the Bell Witch is not found in the limestone of the cave or the dust of the cemetery. It is found in the way we tell the story. It is found in the shiver that runs down our spine when we hear a sound in the walls of our own homes. It is found in the realization that there are still parts of this world that remain forbidden and unknown. Kate did not leave the Red River Valley. She simply moved into our curiosity. She lives in every question we ask about the nature of reality, and every moment we pause to listen to the wind in the trees. As long as there is darkness, there will be a voice in the shadows of Tennessee. The journey is over, and the 23,000 words have been spoken. The long night of the Bell family has finally reached its dawn, and it is time for you to let go of the mysteries and the shadows. The Red River is calm now, and the stars over Adams are bright and still. The past is a country you have visited, but you are safe in the present. Let the weight of the story fade into the softness of your pillow. Let the voices of the night turn into a gentle hum that carries you toward the edge of sleep. You have witnessed the haunting, you have heard the judgment, and you have walked through the cave. Now, there is only the silence. The Bell Witch is at rest. The Red River is at rest. And you are at rest. Sleep now, and let the history of the world become a dream that you watch from a distance. The shadows are gone. The story is finished. Good night.